Ever feel like you hit a wall even when you're super successful?
Yeah, like you're doing everything right, but it's not working anymore.
Right. It's like a weird paradox. The habits that got you to the top should keep things running smoothly.
Well, it's more common than you'd think.
Really?
Yeah, executive coach Marshall Goldsmith calls it the success paradox.
Interesting. So what does that even mean?
He wrote a whole book on it. What got you here won't get you there.
Oh, I've heard of that one.
He basically says the things that help us succeed can become our biggest roadblocks later on.
So we're diving into all of that today.
Exactly.
We've got Goldsmith's book as our main source.
Right.
Plus, we'll look at some real-world examples.
Sounds good.
And the best part is we'll explore how to break free from these bad habits.
Because we all have them.
Exactly. This is for anyone who wants to grow.
Whether you're leading a team or just working on yourself.
So one of the things Goldsmith talks about is how these habits come from these beliefs we have.
Uh-huh. He says it's about the things we tell ourselves while we're trying to succeed.
Like what?
Things like, I can push through anything, or I deserve success because I choose it.
Okay. Yeah, I can see that.
And those beliefs, they can be really empowering at first.
It's like that go-getter attitude, believing in yourself to overcome challenges.
Exactly. But they can also create these blind spots.
How so?
We become so focused on our achievements that we don't see how we affect others.
So they're not bad beliefs,
No, not at all.
just that they can have unintended consequences if we're not careful.
Exactly. And that's where those 20 bad habits come in.
The ones Goldsmith talks about?
Yeah, they're like the downside of those success-driven beliefs.
Okay, so let's get into some of these.
Sure.
The first one that stood out to me was winning too much.
Oh, yeah.
Because isn't that the goal, to win?
Well, you'd think so.
Right.
But Goldsmith's not talking about healthy competition.
Okay.
It's this need to be right all the time, even in casual conversations.
You mean like those people who correct you on the smallest details?
Exactly. Like they can't handle someone else having a point.
Even if it's something insignificant.
Right. And Goldsmith actually says this behavior comes from insecurity.
Really?
It's like they need to prove their worth
Yeah.
by constantly showing they're superior.
It's ironic then because that need to win pushes people away.
Absolutely.
And it creates a less collaborative environment.
Uh-huh. Because who wants to share ideas if they're going to get shot down?
Exactly.
And it can be really bad in leadership positions.
In what way?
Goldsmith talks about a CEO who ranked his team's ideas in meetings.
Oof. I can see how that would backfire.
Yeah, it makes people self-conscious and less likely to contribute.
Makes sense. And that reminds me of another habit, adding too much value.
Yes. The let me improve on that type.
Yep, I've been there. It can be pretty frustrating.
Goldsmith says it's this urge to add to other people's ideas.
Even when they don't ask for it.
Exactly.
And that's interesting because you wouldn't think that's a bad thing.
It's not always bad,
Right?
but Goldsmith says it often comes from a need for control.
So it's not about helping. It's about putting your stamp on everything.
Exactly. And it can stifle creativity.
Because you're not appreciating what they brought to the table.
Right. You feel this urge to make it better.
Like their idea isn't good enough on its own.
And you know what's funny?
What's that?
Goldsmith's advice here is to just say, thank you.
Wait, seriously, just thank you.
Seriously.
Yeah.
It shows respect and encourages them to contribute more.
Makes sense because anything else sends the message their idea wasn't good enough.
Exactly.
Sometimes the simplest answers are the best.
I agree.
Okay, so let's move on to another one.
Okay.
What about passing judgment?
This one's all about giving critiques and opinions even when people don't want them.
Like unsolicited advice.
Exactly. It's like pointing out flaws or offering constructive criticism.
That's not really constructive.
Right. We've all experienced this.
It's like those people who always focus on the negative.
When everyone else is trying to be positive. And what's interesting here is that Goldsmith suggests this habit often stems from a fear of vulnerability.
Oh, that's interesting. So by criticizing others, we're protecting ourselves from being judged.
Right. It's a defense mechanism, deflecting attention from our own imperfections.
But doesn't that end up making things worse? I mean, people are less likely to trust someone who is constantly judging them, right?
You're absolutely right. It creates a less trusting and less collaborative environment. People clam up because they know they're going to be judged or criticized.
And speaking of judgment, I thought it was pretty funny how Goldsmith used himself as a guinea pig when it came to making destructive comments.
That was a great story. He asked his team to call him out.
Every time he said something negative about someone.
Yes, even if he meant it to be funny.
Mm-hmm.
And he offered them $10 for each instance.
Wow. Talk about putting your money where your mouth is. So what happened?
He was shocked by how many negative comments he was actually making.
It really highlights how these small comments can add up and create a toxic work environment.
Exactly. It's not just about avoiding outright insults. We have to be mindful of our tone and how we phrase things. Even a seemingly harmless joke can have a negative impact.
Okay, I relate to this next one a lot. Starting sentences with no, but, or however. I do this all the time.
Uh-huh. Well, you're not alone. It's a really common communication pattern, especially among successful people. It's like we're programmed to offer a counterpoint, even when we agree with the main idea.
Yeah, like we can't just let someone else's idea stand on its own. We always have to add our own spin on things.
Exactly. But think about how it feels to be on the receiving end of that. It feels like you're not being heard.
Yeah, and it can make you less likely to share your ideas in the future.
Absolutely. But the good news is that we can change this pattern. Goldsmith suggests becoming more aware of our speech patterns and consciously choosing to phrase things in a more positive and collaborative way.
It's so easy to slip into those negative patterns without even realizing it, like it's almost an automatic reflex.
You're right, it is. But the more we practice catching ourselves and reframing our language, the easier it becomes to create a more positive and collaborative environment.
So we've been talking about all these habits and these underlying beliefs. But before we go on, I'm curious about this feed-forward thing you mentioned. It sounds like a great idea, but I'm not sure how it works in real life.
That's a good question.
Mm.
And it's important to remember that feed forward isn't a magic solution.
Right. It's not one size fits all.
Exactly. It's more like a framework for approaching growth.
I see. So how you use it depends on the habit you're trying to address.
Right.
Okay, so how would you use feed forward to tackle winning too much?
Well, let's say you realize you always have to be right in conversations.
Okay.
Instead of focusing on past times where this caused problems, you could ask for feedback from someone.
Someone you trust.
Yes. You could say something like, hey, I'm working on being a better listener. Do you have any suggestions for how I can stop dominating conversations?
And be more open to other opinions. And then no matter what they say, you just say, thank you.
That's it. The key is to be open to the feedback, even if you don't like it.
So just asking for suggestions and saying thank you creates a better dynamic.
Exactly.
It's like you're turning a potential argument into a chance to grow.
Precisely. That's the power of feed forward. It shifts the focus from the past to the future.
That makes sense.
So instead of dwelling on what went wrong, you're taking action to create a better future.
I like that. Okay, let's get back to the list.
Sure.
The next one that caught my eye was telling the world how smart we are.
Oh, yeah. I think we've all been there.
Definitely, I've done it myself, especially when I'm feeling insecure.
It's easy to fall into that trap, especially when you've had some success,
It's like you feel this need to prove how much you know.
even when it's not helpful.
It's like we're afraid someone's going to take away our smart card if we don't show off.
Right?
It's almost like we're afraid of being seen as average.
But the irony is trying to prove yourself just comes across as arrogant.
Exactly.
So how do you break this habit? Goldsmith talks about something called inspired neutrality.
What's that?
It's about letting others shine without feeling like you have to steal the spotlight.
That sounds really hard. It's like unlearning a lifetime of habits.
It's not easy, but it can be really freeing.
To not have to prove yourself all the time.
Right, and it lets you connect with people on a deeper level.
Because you're not trying to impress them.
Exactly. It's about genuine connection, not ego.
Okay, let's move on to another one. Speaking when angry.
Uh-oh.
I think we've all seen that one.
It's never pretty.
It's like a volcano erupting.
Goldsmith actually uses an analogy here.
What is it?
He talks about someone yelling at an empty boat floating down a river.
So what's he saying? Our anger is misdirected.
Exactly. It's a primal response, but it rarely helps us.
Especially at work.
Right. When we're angry, we don't think clearly.
Our words can be hurtful.
Yeah. So Goldsmith suggests finding ways to manage our anger before it gets out of control.
Like taking deep breaths or counting to 10.
Exactly. Anything that creates space between the feeling and your reaction.
So you can make a better choice.
Right. Speaking of negativity, the next habit is, let me explain why that won't work.
Oh, those are the worst.
The dream crushers.
They always focus on the downsides.
Goldsmith tells a story about a woman who ran a lecture bureau.
Okay.
She always found reasons why things wouldn't work. She missed out on so many opportunities.
It's like they're allergic to new ideas.
And you know what Goldsmith says?
What?
He thinks this behavior comes from a fear of failure.
That makes sense. By pointing out all the problems, they're protecting themselves.
If it fails, they can say, I told you so.
But then they never get to experience anything new.
And it demotivates everyone around them.
It's a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Exactly.
Okay, next up is withholding information.
I never understood that one.
Me either.
Yeah.
Why would you keep knowledge to yourself when sharing would help everyone?
It's short-sighted thinking. They think they're getting an advantage, but they're really hurting the team.
It's like trying to win by making everyone else lose.
Goldsmith says sharing information makes you a more valuable resource.
And it builds trust.
Exactly. Speaking of recognizing others, next up is failing to give proper recognition.
I know, I've been guilty of that one.
It happens we get so focused on our own achievements that we forget about others.
But it's so demotivating when you feel like your work doesn't matter.
Goldsmith talks about how it deprives people of closure.
It's like running a marathon and never getting to cross the finish line.
Exactly. And it's not just about being polite. It's about valuing the people around you.
Goldsmith suggests making it a habit to give recognition regularly.
Like setting reminders or keeping a gratitude journal.
He talks about a client who made a list of important people.
And he checks it twice a week to see who deserves a shout out.
I like that. It makes it a conscious effort.
Instead of something you only do sometimes.
Right. So on the other side of that, we have claiming credit we don't deserve.
That's even worse.
Because you're taking credit away from someone else.
It's all about making yourself look good, even if it hurts others.
It's totally unethical.
And people can see right through it.
So how do you avoid this trap?
It's about humility and recognizing that success is rarely a solo effort.
It's about sharing the credit, not taking it all for yourself.
Exactly. Okay, next up we have making excuses.
I think we all do that sometimes.
It's natural to want to avoid blame.
But if you always make excuses, you never learn from your mistakes.
Goldsmith shares a story about how his mom discouraged him from learning mechanical skills.
Really?
Yeah. And he realized later that he had internalized that belief.
It's amazing how those early messages can shape us.
It reminds us to question those limiting beliefs.
Instead of saying, I'm not good at that, ask yourself, how can I get better?
Exactly. It's about having a growth mindset.
Okay. The next habit is clinging to the past.
This one can be tricky.
Because you need to learn from your past.
Right. But clinging to the past isn't about learning.
It's about holding on to resentment and blame.
And it stops you from moving forward.
So it's not about denying the past.
No.
It's about focusing on what you can control in the present.
Exactly. Goldsmith compares it to a client who spends therapy complaining about his parents.
Instead of working on his own issues,
Right?
it's like driving while looking in the rearview mirror. You're going to crash.
Perfect analogy.
Yeah.
So how can we use feed forward here?
Good question.
Instead of dwelling on the past, ask yourself, what can I do today to create a better future?
Shift your focus from why me to what now.
Exactly. Okay, moving on to playing favorites.
This one always causes problems.
It's about giving preferential treatment to certain people.
Oh, usually the ones you like best.
And it creates a toxic environment.
Because it's unfair.
People need to know you're being fair.
Goldsmith has an exercise for this.
Oh, yeah.
You rank your team based on how much you think they like you.
And then you compare that to their actual contributions and the recognition you give them.
If there's a correlation between liking and recognition, you might be playing favorites.
It makes you confront your biases.
Okay, the next one is refusing to express regret.
This one can be tough.
I know people who just can't apologize.
It gets in the way of relationships.
And it's a missed opportunity to grow.
Goldsmith says a sincere apology can be really powerful.
It shows you're taking responsibility.
He has a client who turned his whole life around by learning to apologize.
Sometimes the simplest things make the biggest difference.
Okay, next up is not listening.
We've all done that.
It happens.
Are we just too busy?
Could be. Or maybe we think we already know everything.
Goldsmith says it's about not being present in the conversation.
You're not really hearing what the other person is saying.
It's funny because he learned about active listening from his mentor.
Who was known for not listening.
Sometimes we learn the most from the people who challenge us.
And then we have failing to express gratitude.
This is similar to giving recognition.
Right. It's
Yep.
about showing appreciation.
Goldsmith tells a story about a lawyer who got praised for his writing.
And he realized he owed it to his high school English teacher,
It's a reminder to be thankful for the people who helped us along the way.
even years later.
Okay, next is punishing the messenger.
This one creates a culture of fear,
Because you're shooting down the person who brings you bad news.
even if it's not their fault.
It's like the emperor's new clothes.
No one wants to tell me he's naked.
Goldsmith says leaders need to create a safe environment for bad news.
where people can speak up without being punished.
Okay, now for passing the buck.
This is like making excuses, but worse.
Because you're blaming someone else.
Goldsmith tells a story about a media executive who always blamed his team.
It ruined his reputation?
We need to own our mistakes.
Okay, so we've covered 18 habits. What are the last two?
Second to last is an excessive need to be me.
So like being stuck in your ways.
Right. You resist change even when it would be good for you.
Goldsmith talks about an executive who refused to improve his recognition skills.
Because it wouldn't be him.
It's like saying, I'd rather stay the same even if it makes me a worse person.
And finally, we have goal obsession.
But aren't goals good?
They can be, but Goldsmith says you can become too focused on them.
So you neglect other important things.
Like relationships and your own well-being.
He uses the story of Colonel Nicholson from Bridge on the River Kwai.
He became so obsessed with building the bridge that he lost sight of everything else.
So how can we use feed-forward here?
Ask yourself, how can I achieve this goal without hurting myself or others?
It's about finding balance.
Right. True success is more than just achievements.
It's about living a meaningful life.
Exactly. We've covered a lot of ground here.
We've talked about all these habits that can hold us back.
So what do we do now?
How do we actually change these behaviors?
Oh.
Okay, so we spent all this time talking about the problems. Now I want to talk about solutions.
That's the fun part.
Right. So we've identified the habits. Now how do we change them?
Well, Goldsmith talks about this idea of feed forward.
Yeah, you mentioned that earlier.
It's a powerful tool for growth.
But it sounds kind of futuristic, like something out of Star Trek.
It is forward thinking. But it's actually very simple.
Really?
Instead of dwelling on the past, you focus on solutions for the future.
So you're not ignoring your mistakes.
No, you acknowledge them, but you don't dwell on them.
Okay. So you shift your focus from what went wrong to what you can do better.
Exactly. It's about being proactive.
Instead of reactive.
Right. So instead of beating yourself up, you ask for suggestions.
Suggestions on how to improve.
Exactly.
Can you give me an example?
Sure. Let's say you realize you interrupt people a lot.
Okay.
Instead of thinking about all the times you did that in the past,
Right.
you could ask someone for feedback.
Like, how can I stop interrupting?
Exactly. You could say, hey, I'm working on being a better listener. Do you have any tips for how I can avoid interrupting people?
So you're turning a criticism into a request for help.
Right. And you're showing that you're open to learning.
I see. And what did Goldsmith say about how to respond to the feedback?
He says, just say thank you.
No matter what they say.
Exactly. Even if you don't like the feedback.
That's tough. It's hard not to get defensive.
It is.
Yeah.
But that's the key to feed forward.
It creates a safe space for honest feedback.
Right. People feel like they can be helpful without being judged.
So it's like you're inviting people to help you grow.
Exactly. And that's way more motivating than just focusing on your mistakes.
I love this idea. It's like turning a negative into a positive.
And it shifts your mindset from feeling stuck to feeling empowered.
Because you're not just identifying the problem, you're actively looking for solutions.
Right. It's about taking ownership and choosing to create a better future.
This is so inspiring. It's easy to get caught up in self-criticism.
But Feed Forward gives you a way to break free from that.
And actually make positive changes.
Exactly.
I'm definitely going to try this.
It can be really powerful. And remember, change takes time.
It's a process.
Right. Be patient with yourself.
One thing that really struck me is how we all have these blind spots.
We do.
These habits we might not even realize are holding us back.
It's true. We all have strengths and weaknesses.
And it's through self-awareness that we can grow.
Exactly. Goldsmith talks about paying attention to feedback moments.
What are those?
Those times when you get clues about your behavior.
But you might ignore them.
Right. But if you pay attention, they can teach you a lot.
It's about being more mindful.
Exactly.
And those clues can come from anywhere.
A comment from a coworker or a feeling you get.
It's about being honest with yourself.
And remember, you have the power to change.
It's a choice.
As Goldsmith says, we can break free from our limitations.
And achieve even greater things. This has been such a great deep dive.
I'm glad you enjoyed it.
Thank you for sharing all these insights.
It was my pleasure.
And for giving us such practical advice.
Anytime.
So the key takeaway for me is that personal growth is an ongoing journey.
It is.
And if you're feeling stuck, remember the power of Feed Forward.
Ask for help.
Yeah.
Be open to feedback. And focus on the future.
That's great advice. So on that note, we'll wrap up this deep dive.
Thanks for listening.
Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep diving deep.